The more you listen to your kids, the closer you'll be. So we asked kids, what do you want your parents to hear?
I feel sometimes that I'm not listened to. I would just want you to listen to me more often and evaluate situations with me and lead me towards success.
Listening is a form of love. Find resources to help you support your kids and their emotional well-being at sounditouttogether.org. That's sounditouttogether.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and Pivotal.
Here's a tip for you. There's a podcast out there with fans waiting to be your next customer. They tune in every week, they trust the host, and that host wants to talk about brands like yours in their own words to their audience. The problem is, you just haven't been introduced yet. We're Acast, where that introduction happens. As the world's largest podcast marketplace, we let you browse shows, see who's listening, and book host-read sponsorships or run your own ads, all from one platform. Transparent pricing, real-time data, complete control. Start advertising on podcasts by visiting acast.com/advertise.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I want to talk about Harold Wilson again today. I have an abiding fascination with Wilson as the most successful British Prime Minister of the 20th century, and also somebody who presided over the kind of the dying or the beginnings of the slow death of British social democracy, and who excited or sort of attracted the most excitable paranoid fantasies on the part of the British right, and who, if they had really thought about Wilson for more than 2 minutes, would have seen him as, not necessarily an ally, but certainly not a danger. I'm mindful to think about Wilson now because when you hear the rhetoric on the British right, the Conservative Party, the Reform Party, Restore kind of crypto-fascist party, and various other kind of extreme fringe figures, when they talk about the very basics of post-war social democracy, they equate, the moderate centre ground of social democratic thought. The idea that workers should have rights, the ideas that there should be some sort of social safety net, the idea that there should be a public health service. These are referred to as kind of communist ideas, which, I don't know, maybe communist countries might feature some of these concepts, and yet none of their proponents in the 20th century in Great Britain have been anything approaching communist. Some of them you couldn't even describe as socialists. Very few of them looked upon the British economy and society and thought that wealth and power should be particularly democratized. And Wilson was one of the first kind of major targets of this hysteria. You can see a kind of a highly opportunistic version of it happening in America at the moment, with the kind of the appeal of Mamdani and others like him, and the Trump is trying to spin the idea of this kind of Manichaean apocalyptic battle emerging against what he refers to as communism, which it certainly isn't. So today I'm reading Smear, Wilson and the Secret State by Stephen Dorrell and Robert Ramsey, which I've read from before, and chapter 13, Wilson as Corporatist. And it reads, despite the fantasies of Peter Wright and his ilk, Peter Wright being the MI5 agent determined to bring down Wilson, who was involved in the campaign of bugging and burglaries against the Wilson government in the 70s. Wilson was never a socialist, let alone a communist. From the 1940s onwards, he remained true to the vision of a mixed economy, but one in which private enterprise required to be guided, instructed, and either bullied by the state if the national economy was to prosper. This is what he had experienced while in government during and after the war. Wilson had been the young expert, the man with the slide rule, who had shaken up the fuddy-duddy Whitehall during the war, who had sneered at the city during the bank rate affair of 57 and 58 for being run by amateurs, footling around about on grouse moors while Britain was falling behind, for the commanding heights of the British economy to be controlled today by men whose only claim is their aristocratic connections or the power of inherited wealth or speculative finance is as irrelevant to the 20th century as it would be as would be the continued purchase of commissions in the armed forces by lordly amateurs. In science and industry, we are content to remain a nation of gentlemen in a world of players. So that was Wilson, and Wilson was best described as a corporatist. The idea that capitalism should be allowed to exist, and yet should be managed and modernized, and the idea that we leave it to kind of gentlemen amateurs is an anathema. And part of Wilson's kind of philosophy when it came to Britain's upper classes was that they were behind the times. These were kind of complacent and slightly incompetent members of the aristocracy who cared more for grouse shoots than they did for the business of building a new modern Britain from its imperial past. And obviously he was focused there on a class that would fiercely resist him. And these were the sorts of people wearing, tweeds and carrying shotguns who met for informal meetings with people like Mountbatten in 1967 on the possibility of a military coup against Wilson. And that is, when you kind of think about it in that sense, I mean, the coup never came off, but the fact that there were so many plots against Wilson, and there was more than one coup plot, it does tend to show you how superficial British democracy is, and how British democracy survives sometimes by the slenderest of margins. The state would force change and settlement. Between 1944 and 50, Wilson had experienced the state at its most activist in the country's history. It is impossible to exaggerate the significance of the lesson about the inefficiency of the market system learned by Wilson and others during the war. However, this had not made him any sort of socialist. He might occasionally talk of nationalising the commanding heights of the economy, but he'd always wanted a mixed economy. In the Commons in 1949, he boasted that private enterprises produced on a vastly greater scale under this socialist government than it ever did when we had a Tory government. In 1948, for example, he spoke of ending a host of restrictive arrangements in British industry, which have had the effect of frustrating and destroying the operation of that free enterprise, which I think some sentimentalists fondly imagined characterised British industry. Competition is the public's natural safeguard in any industry which continues on the basis of private enterprise. These views never altered. They are all to be found in his piece in the New Statesman, 24th of March 1961. I'll see if I can find a link to that somewhere online. Often these things are kicking around. If nothing else, the Party of Manufacturing, Labour, were enthusiastic readers of the stream of books which appeared diagnosing Britain's problem. The most famous was Michael Shank's The Stagnant Society in 1961. Although Wilson frequently used the vague rhetoric of science, modernity and technology, more than frequently, I mean, he talked about transforming the country in the white heat of technology.
The more you listen to your kids, the closer you'll be. So we asked kids, what do you want your parents to hear?
I feel sometimes that I'm not listened to. I would just want you to listen to me more often and evaluate situations with me and lead me towards success.
Listening is a form of love. Find resources to help you support your kids and their emotional well-being at soundedouttogether.org. That's soundedouttogether.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and Pivotal.
Here's a tip for you. There's a podcast out there with fans waiting to be your next customer. They tune in every week, they trust the host, and that host wants to talk about brands like yours in their own words to their audience. The problem is, you just haven't been introduced yet. We're Acast, where that introduction happens. As the world's largest podcast marketplace, we let you browse shows, see who's listening, and book host-read sponsorships or run your own ads, all from one platform. Transparent pricing, real-time data, complete control. Start advertising on podcasts by visiting acast.com/advertise.
He was not afraid to spell out its full implications, achieving the release of energy he talked of so often. Economic growth in the manufacturing sector would require the state not just to take control of macroeconomic policy, but to take it from the City of London. Now, the argument there is that speculative capital goes where the returns are greatest. And that does not necessarily mean it goes into a generational transformation of British industry into new technologies. Often, speculative capital doesn't do that. Speculative capital just simply goes where the returns are greatest. And so the idea is that the state was the machinery for modernisation. Some might equate that, again, this sort of this fevered kind of paranoia about secret, communists here and there, is based on this idea of statism. Whenever I periodically run into people online decrying one of my videos that I did ages ago about how Hitler is not a socialist, the argument they put forward to years is they talk about statism. And actually, I mean, Hitler was, there's some evidence of that, and in other cases, there's less of it. I don't want to even get into that debate today, but statism is not socialism. It can be it can coexist with socialism, but there have been some extremely right-wing statists in the 20th century, and despite their attempts to dismantle the states, both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher both relied heavily on the power of the state, and this idea is particularly prevalent amongst the self-employed and small and medium-sized enterprise operators who look with suspicion at a state that will tax them, regulate them, and in their wildest, darkest dreams, take their businesses away from them, of which, of course, the British state has never really done. The belief that taking this away from the City of London was essential. Again, it fires up some of the kind of the darkest and deepest reactionary forces in Great Britain, the sorts of people who do sit around in cigar smoke filled rooms imagining about a different future. In the House of Commons on the 11th of July 1960, he spelled this out. Honourable members, and by the way, he becomes Prime Minister in 64. So, honourable members opposite believe that the fulfilment of this release of energy can be left to a system which, in its essentials and institutions, and above all, in its motivations, has changed little since the Forsyths. Our merchant bankers, our discount houses, our bank parlours, our daily more powerful insurance companies all have a job to do, and an important job, but they exceed their function if they claim to be regulators and directors of our economy. Our economic development will be safeguarded only when the government party in the House accepts that, however vital, finance is the handmaiden and not the controller of our economic development. Part of the purpose of the Thatcher Revolution was to overthrow that concept entirely, and to place the workings of the market as the kind of the sole economic logic that shaped the country. And we are in a situation now where governments of every stripe will tell you that pretty much nothing can be done because you don't want to upset the bond markets. Upset bond markets mean more expensive borrowing, means inflation, means you lose the next election. This is what neoliberalism was always designed to achieve. Firstly, to create this sort of notion of pure market sovereignty. But of course, markets are just kind of abstractions. They're invisible things that we make up in our brains. Whereas what a market really is a set of social relations. There are people with more market power, i.e. more money. And neoliberalism was always about replacing the rule of democracy, such as it ever was, with the rule of capital. To allow people with money to transform money into political power. Not that they were having much trouble with that anyway, but the gains that organised labour had made in the 20th century from the 70s onwards needed to be rolled back.
The more you listen to your kids, the closer you'll be. So we asked kids, what do you want your parents to hear?
I feel sometimes that I'm not listened to. I would just want you to listen to me more often and evaluate situations with me and lead me towards success.
Listening is a form of love. Find resources to help you support your kids and their emotional well-being at sounditouttogether.org. That's sounditouttogether.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and Pivotal.
With Cricket Wireless, you can count on reliable nationwide 5G because Cricket Wireless is on the AT&T network, which means you can start listening to that new album that just dropped at home, while running errands, and at the gym without any hiccups. Find plans with unlimited data for every lifestyle and price point. Switch to Cricket today.
During the protracted pre-election period in 1964, it was the more easily digestible rhetoric of science, modernisation and efficiency, bringing meritocratic justice, which dominated Labour's rhetoric. The party promised that under them, the Producers' Alliance, between manufacturing industry, unions and labour, which in Wilson's view had won the war, would be recreated. Such corporatist ideas were not unique to the Labour Party, of course. A section of the Conservative Party in the British manufacturing had learned the same lesson and had in effect accepted the post-war social settlement as legitimate. Somewhat to Wilson's irritation in the 1962-63, the Tories took up many of these ideas, setting up the National Economic Development Council, a National Incomes Commission, and supporting some degree of planning. During 1964, another president of the Board of Trade, Edward Heath, announced legislation to extend the scope of a number of scientific bodies advocating more industrial research. Later, the basis of the Ministry of Technology, which comes under the Wilson government of 64. However, while the Federation of British Industry, the CBI's antecedent, for example, could embrace economic planning, the corporatist conservatives had to edge slowly towards such notions, taking the rest of the party, city men and the economic liberals with them. And if you imagine, Heath is finally unseated 11 years later in 75 by Thatcher, who then goes on to win in 79. Heath was, in Heath's budget of 70, many kind of emergent proto-neoliberal principles were there. But if Heath wanted to run the country like the chairman of a great British corporation, he wanted to be like the chairman of ICI or BP. When Thatcher came to power, it was the model of economical sort of economic stroke political organisation that she's drawing from isn't corporate, it's financial. It's about allowing finance off the leash. And Heath wasn't quite there. And so a lot of the kind of the accommodation of corporatism in the Conservative Party and the idea that a mixed economy with some role for organised labour. So, after 3 years of run-ins with the unions, Heath was much less keen on that. Had a place. Thatcher's revolution, really, or counter-revolution, was about destroying that notion. At the 1961 Labour Party conference, Wilson mocked the Conservatives' conversion to planning. Suddenly last summer, planning ceased to be a dirty word in Tory circles. It is said that they have stolen our clothes. They have not. They have stolen the label sewn into the backs of our trousers. But it is only a label and will be a mighty poor cover for their nakedness. The corporatist structure, which the 1964 Labour government inherited, was only a shadow of the thing itself, the state being allocated little more than a consultancy role. The intention was radical enough. The power of the Treasury would be broken, the management of the economic and technological acceleration would be handled by the new Department of Economic Affairs and of Technology. A Ministry of Technology had been part of the 64 Labour Party manifesto. Now, it's interesting that Andy Burnham is once again trying to do this thing that almost no Labour politician, no Labour Prime Minister has ever succeeded, which is breaking the power of the Treasury and breaking the power of Treasury think, which is really kind of austerity think, permanent austerity. I don't fancy Burnham's chances, and he seems to be extremely muddled in his approach so far. And for somebody that wants to overthrow neoliberalism, he isn't half embracing its basic principles on a daily basis at the moment. But there are striking parallels here. The idea of number 10 North, of creating a 10 Downing Street office in Manchester, and of devolving decision making to mayors, and of trying to take economic decisions out of number 11 Downing Street and out of the grips of the Treasury, which successive Labour governments have blamed for their ills, and with good reason. There's huge parallels with Wilson here. The difficulty was that Wilson was committed to defending the dollar-sterling exchange rate at $2.80 as the quid pro quo for American financial support against the city attacks over the British deficit. Defending the currency, however, severely reduced the options in other areas, such as increasing domestic economic growth. A strong pound is not good for trade. Substantial deficit-generating activities, such as would have been prescribed by orthodox Keynesians, and such as had indeed been attempted by the preceding Conservative Chancellor Reginald Maudling, would damage the trade balance and thus the pound-dollar exchange rate. Once the decision had been taken, the state of the balance of payments and confidence in the economy became the criteria by which the government judged the success or failure of its policy. In these circumstances, it was inevitable that the Treasury would retain its dominance over Whitehall because its responsibility for finance and the balance of payments had survived the coming of the DEA, Department of Economic Affairs. And although the destruction of the Department of Economic Affairs by the Treasury has been well documented elsewhere, little attention has been given to the detail of that defeat. It began while Labour was still in opposition. Naively, the Labour shadow cabinet had gone along with the so-called Douglas Hume rules, which, in Peter Hennessy's generous view, constitutional historian, allowed the opposition access to Whitehall in advance of an election to put their planned changes to the permanent secretaries. This still exists. Alternatively, it gives the permanent government advance notice of changes, permanent government being the civil service, of changes and time to sabotage them. This is what happened to the DEA. The DEA blueprint prepared by the permanent secretary at the Treasury excluded any provision for physical essentials, office furniture, telephones, paper, so they were essentially sent to a broom cupboard. By the time that the staff had actually got their hands on such basics, they found themselves excluded from the information flow from the rest of Whitehall. The urbane Peter Hennessy talks of turf fights. Sabotage of Labour policy is more appropriate. Anyway, so without going deep into the structure of the new Labour government in 1964, what emerges is a picture of a centre-left corporatist in Wilson, not a socialist, not a communist, and somebody who was committed to defence, who was committed to maintaining the monarchy, who was highly patriotic, who believed in British colonial presence around the world, and who believed simply that there was a role for Labour, government and business working together in not a planned economy, but a managed economy. And this was Bolshevism when revealed to the people that would bring the government down. Newspaper barons, senior civil servants, bankers and spies. Anyway, more on that cheery chapter at some point in the future, and we've got an amazing, fascinating and brilliant episode for you coming tomorrow. I've been planning this for a while. I'm very much looking forward to it. And we are going to be having a conversation tomorrow with James Loeffler, the Felix Posen Professor of Modern Jewish History at Johns Hopkins University. And we're going to be looking at really the uses and the abuses of anti-Semitism, and the uses and the abuses of how anti-Semitism is perceived and resisted. Anyway, let's have a look at that tomorrow. Take good care, folks. All the best. Bye-bye.
The more you listen to your kids, the closer you'll be. So we asked kids, what do you want your parents to hear?
I feel sometimes that I'm not listened to. I would just want you to listen to me more often and evaluate situations with me and lead me towards success.
Listening is a form of love. Find resources to help you support your kids and their emotional well-being at sounditouttogether.org. That's sounditouttogether.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and Pivotal.
Here's a tip for you. There's a podcast out there with fans waiting to be your next customer. They tune in every week, they trust the host, and that host wants to talk about brands like yours in their own words to their audience. The problem is, you just haven't been introduced yet. We're Acast, where that introduction happens. As the world's largest podcast marketplace, we let you browse shows, see who's listening, and book host-read sponsorships or run your own ads, all from one platform. Transparent pricing, real-time data, complete control. Start advertising on podcasts by visiting acast.com/advertise.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.